Hello and welcome back to the Conflict Skills Podcast. I'm your host, professional mediator Simon Goode. In this podcast, I provide free resources and tools for dealing with conflict, whether that is connected to workplace situations or other types of conflict outside of work. So if that sounds like the kind of thing that's useful for you, please consider pressing subscribe. In today's episode of the podcast, I'm going to be talking about some tips for parents with children, so, some of the parenting challenges that we might need to deal with in the morning. And I'm going to be talking about some strategies that you can use for a smoother experience for everybody involved. In other words, how you can avoid the tension, the build-up of escalation, the repeated levels of frustration when kids just can't find their socks, or you've told them 6 times when they need to leave, and despite that, they still seem to be dragging their heels. And like, my son's 8 years old, and this morning I was telling him, you need to go and brush your teeth, you got 15 minutes, you got 10 minutes, you got 5 minutes. And then I go in and find him lying on my bed, just sprawled out, relaxing kind of thing. And I'm thinking, like, there's this disconnection from reality almost that seems to be occurring for him. And so you can probably imagine that it's quite on theme for me today, thinking about some options for avoiding some of the conflict that comes about. I've told you 6 times, that kind of thing. And today, because most of my focus in my work these days is on workplace mediation, I actually think it's quite important for that area anyway. Like, the experience that we have before we arrive to work affects the emotional state that we walk in the door with, right? And so if you've already had a battle with the kids trying to get them to find their socks and get their shoes on and get them in the car, etc., and drop them off to school, and by the way, that whole experience of drop off and pick up can be just a huge spike of adrenaline and cortisol for everybody involved as well. So we've got these challenges that cause us, a different level of escalation through the morning. And when that happens, what occurs in our brain is that we release cortisol, the stress hormone that more or less gets us ready for action. And most of the action that we get ready for is physical. You might have heard this fight or flight response, that phrasing previously. So that sort of describes the way that we often prepare for dealing with threats. And fight or flight have been two pretty good options for dealing with threats historically, thinking about human evolution. It's not ideal when I'm trying to get my 8-year-old to put his socks on or brush his teeth or whatever. And I certainly don't want to walk into my professional setting already ramped up with a level of being ready to fight or fly or flee. If I'm having an important meeting with a client, for example, the last thing I want is to get ready to fight them if they ask me a difficult question, or I don't know what my body's getting ready for, jumping out the window all of a sudden if things become too tense, or I say something goofy and I get really embarrassed, or whatever else it might be. So this build-up of cortisol, whether it's in our home or our work life, is cumulative. You might have heard this phrasing, work-life balance, that implies some type of separation between work and home, but of course our experience of both is much more integrated than that. So I think if you can figure out options for having a smoother morning, it will actually help in your professional experience and, your workplace, and probably reducing the level of workplace conflict that occurs as a result, or your ability to manage it would be higher. But when I first got trained as a mediator, I was working with couples who were going through divorce and separation. And I sort of stumbled into it, to be honest. It wasn't necessarily an area that I was planning to move into, mediation or conflict. I'm a naturally quite a conflict avoidant type of person. Well, I'm not conflict avoidant. I have a lot of drama that occurs in my head, and I can be quite blunt and rude and not very sensitive in the comments that I make. But, I'm not really an alpha kind of person. I probably prefer diplomacy versus going out and threatening somebody, for example. So mediation probably wasn't a natural area that I would have thought that I got into. I actually applied for a job that was called a counsellor, but it was working with families who were going through divorce and separation. And to be honest, I didn't discover the full extent of that until after I'd done all my training and I'd been there for a little while. It wasn't just with people going through divorce. It was court-ordered clients that had been often in court, family court, for a number of years, like 3 or 4 years. Almost always these involved situations with child abuse, drug and alcohol use, mental health issues, suicide, family violence, like the full spectrum of, complex issues that the phrasing counsellors might use. So that was an easy type of conflict to be dealing with. I was meeting with, mum and dad and talking to them about options for supporting their kid, and these people just hated each other, like really despised each other. Sometimes there was a bit of fear and anxiety, but I think more commonly it was hatred. And I really struggled to figure out options that would help them to stop reacting. Like pretty frequently, an arrangement might be something like the kids go to mum for, like through the week, and then they go to dad's on the weekend or every second weekend, or there might be a midweek changeover type of thing. Changeover, handover. The terminology for all this stuff is just so gross. I found it very challenging thinking about the experience of kids. You know what I mean? Like handover. Like, how would you feel if you're going to hand over and people are handing you over? Like, it does, I don't know if that's necessarily the connotation that parents necessarily want their kids to have about themselves. But anyway, so they were going to these handovers or changeovers or whatever you'd call them. The kids are going to the other parent. They would often meet at McDonald's or at a park or something. And then there would always be a fight. There was always an argument. There would be negative comments made, etc. And what I actually ended up finding that helped to prevent some of this was that both of the parents separately developed better strategies for managing the buildup of stress leading up to it, which might involve the other parent. Like maybe they would get a rude SMS message and they would start to fume, they would see red and they would get worked up a little bit. And so I talked to them about options for calming themselves down in that kind of a moment, but also for minimizing the potential for that escalation to occur. Like, for example, getting their partner to check the text message and read it to them might mean that they don't have the same emotional reaction when they see the person's name and the message pop up, for example, or scheduling a time every 10 minutes where they'll go away and check it so that they're not doing it in front of the kids and the kids don't see the furrowed brow as they read the message and, start to criticize in their head what the other parent has said. So I think actually one of the ways that we can prevent a lot of types of conflict is preventing that build-up, that gradual process of escalation. And we tend to infect each other in these kind of situations. It's a cumulative thing that's like contagious. If you can imagine in my household when everybody's getting ready in the morning, if one person really loses it, like they get really angry, it might be me, and I start yelling and stamping around and slamming things. And do you know what I mean? Like, it's just obvious when I'm frustrated and I'm spilling out almost. Other people pick up on it, of course, and they might take the retreat, the flight type of response, walking on eggshells, talking quietly, avoiding me, staying out of my way. Or they might take the fight type of response, which is to say to me, you are overreacting. Are you serious? It's a relatively minor thing. Do you need to give us all a massive drama from the word go? We all want a peaceful, positive morning. So can you pull your head in and, smarten up a little bit kind of thing? Like they might take that type of approach. And to be honest, if they're getting frustrated, they're not going to use words as considered as that. It's probably like, what the F is the matter with you or something like that. So I think actually this options that we have for avoiding conflict with our kids and avoiding that gradual process of escalation, you shouldn't underestimate the benefit that it can have, I guess. Don't underestimate the positive impact for yourself and arriving to work and having less drama and less stress under your belt from the word go, but also the benefits for your kids. Like you want them to arrive to school and being able to concentrate and, being less reactive. So when someone makes a rude comment to them, they don't take it as personally and, they don't fly off the handle. Well, you can help them by keeping the environment for them more contained and more calm in the morning, so they don't experience that gradual buildup of cortisol too. So I think the most important part of this is self-awareness. It's like developing the ability to zoom out and identify the patterns. Like when you're in the moment and your child says something like, I can't find my socks, just pausing and considering rationally what's at stake. We, I think, tend to have much more of an automatic process of reacting to situations than a lot of us assume. Actually, it's one of the really interesting parts that's coming out of some of the research on AI is that way that it develops what are called tokens, like all of the different levels of meaning that you can attach to something like a word or a person or a place or a topic or anything really. So it's like, my son, socks, what are the things that it might represent? It could be places that it is, or potentially triggers for arguments and conflict that we have. It might be for him representing annoyance because it takes time. It might be he doesn't like putting the uncomfortable shoes on, so it could be connected to that. So his reaction to socks is probably connected to all of those different tokens that his brain uses to interpret the word socks, right? And then his reaction is almost like a roll of a dice, or however you might say it, depending on which of those possible options that he might prioritize in his thinking. And I think then a lot of us tell ourselves a story and we rationalize our decision after the fact, whereas in the moment, it's probably not a rational, logical process as much as a lot of us might assume. But you can deliberately do that. And the way that you do it is pausing and deliberate logical reflection, asking yourself questions like, what's at stake here? What are my options? What do I normally do when my child says, where's my socks? Is that ideal, or could we tweak that or adjust that so that it's more likely to get to a better outcome? For me, when I pause and do this, a lot of the time I actually just let it go. If we think about the 5 different options that we have for dealing with conflict, we've got avoid, accommodate, compromise, compete, and collaborate. So when your child says something like, I can't find my socks, you could collaborate and say, come on, mate, I'll find it with you. Or is there anyone else upstairs that can help you? You could compete and say, I told you to find them earlier, go and get them now. You could say it a bit more kindly than that, but you're basically sticking to your guns. You could accommodate and say, I'll grab them for you. Or if you come downstairs, I'll get you a clean pair out of the laundry. You could compromise and say, look, if you look upstairs, I'll check downstairs for you. But I think actually a lot of the time I end up avoiding it. I acknowledge what they're saying. I say, okay, so you're still looking. Okay, so you haven't found them yet. Like all I really do is empathize, but I resist that urge to jump into one of those other options, the compete, collaborate, compromise, accommodate, etc. Because with those 5 different choices for dealing with conflict, each of them come with different positive and negative consequences. Like the competing is going to annoy him and get him more frustrated, and I might cop that and experience some type of a reaction later. Or if I end up accommodating, I get frustrated and worked up, and that's the kind of stuff that leads to me snapping and being grumpy later. Whereas avoid, if there's not as much at stake, they are going to look, you've got an extra minute or two. For me, I think that's actually been quite a helpful option if I can combine it with self-regulation, like taking a couple of deep breaths, for example. The next thing that this helps with, this meta-analysis or just pausing and asking yourself questions like what's going on right now in this situation, is that we recognize that we are not our thoughts and we are not our feelings. These are just signals. These are just kind of like automatic processes that our brain is using to respond to the way that it's interpreting the situation. Not even an objective interpretation, but a subjective interpretation. And it helps us to create distance. Now, the more escalated that we get, the harder that this becomes, creating distance from your thoughts and your feelings. What tends to happen is that we drift into things like catastrophizing. Like if my child says he can't find his socks, like I'm like, we're gonna be late. I really ratchet it up to a 9 out of 10 level of intensity, whereas rationally, it's not such a big deal. Even if he's 2 minutes late for school and I'm 2 minutes late for work, who cares? Like it's negative. It's a problem if it's a pattern, but I mean, I just think, honestly, when I ask myself these questions like, who cares? Ultimately, probably nobody does. And a lot of my worrying is that there's a cumulative effect. Like I know with kids, you give them an inch and they'll take a mile. So I'm really careful about slippage in expectations. Like what scope creep with clients. Do you know what I mean? My son, if I make him breakfast one morning, he expects me to make it for him the next day. And so that's a little bit of, I think, my level of catastrophizing is, what am I locking myself into here? Or if I let him get away with something, I worry that he'll miss the opportunity to develop this skill set or self-reliance or something. Whereas if I pause and step back, it's probably not such a big deal as I'm making it. I don't know if that resonates with you and you've had a similar type of experience or not. We need to be careful about our self-talk in these types of mornings. Like, I notice for me, I tend to get in a bit of a broken record pattern of complaining. I've told him 6 times. This happens every day. For God's, you know what I mean? Like, I do sometimes internally say things like, for God's sakes, it's ridiculous, or sometimes even meaner things than that, especially about my son or my wife. And I don't believe this rationally. Like, I think they are, honestly, the best people that I've ever met. Of course, there's things that annoy me, but, pausing and thinking about it for a moment, I don't think this is even. Like, I would annoy them far more than they annoy me, if I'm honest. Like, I think I tend to be quite an erratic and unpredictable kind of person at times. I mean, I have my positives and negatives too, but I'm not some saint. You know what I mean? I'm not some martyr. But in the moment, it's easy to develop tunnel vision and put our blinkers on and only focus on, the annoyance that we've experienced or what they've done to contribute to the problem. And we don't think about what we might have done to contribute to it in our turn. So I look out for this catastrophizing. I pay attention to self-talk. Self-talk? Oh gosh, that's a very Australian pronunciation that I use for the word talk. It's like my dad says, "G'day, Simon, you want to have a talk?" I wonder if you're from overseas, America or the UK or somewhere, put a comment in if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. How do you find my accent? I've worked overseas as an English teacher for a couple of years, so I can slow down and speak in more of a less Australianized ochre type of accent, but I like speaking in my Australian way at times as well. So I suppose for me, I always try and find the right balance. When I'm doing workshops, I tend to go a little bit more Aussie because I'm dealing with Australian people who are probably used to the vernacular and the slang and all that kind of stuff. So I say things like, put your blinkers on, which I'm talking about like horse racing, where they wear blinkers to stop them from looking left and right, just concentrate straight ahead. Now, what we tend to develop blinkers around in conflict, and as my son's yelling out something like he can't find his socks, it's blame. What we tend to look for is an external attribution for a negative event. Like if we're late, it's his fault. Realistically, I think we've both done things to contribute to the situation. Like I could have woken him up 5 minutes earlier, and then even if he did exactly the same thing that he did, we wouldn't be late. But in the moment, I tend to attribute it to him. It's his fault kind of thing. So I pay particular attention about attribution for cause. Like the way that I often deal with this is try to describe the situation a little bit more neutrally. Like it's 8:32, we normally leave at 8:30, like it's 2 minutes later than normal. That's the fact. We're late, I can't believe this always happens. This type of labeling, I think, makes me feel more stressed, and that stress tends to spread and infect others, as a result. So focus on self-regulation. In other episodes of my podcast or on the YouTube channel, I often talk about strategies like breathing techniques that you can use, or ways of adjusting your perspective or what you're focused on in order to lower your level of escalation. But these would be the kind of situations where that would be particularly important. So that's the first step. Develop that ability to adjust your focus, to step back and take that bigger picture perspective, to detach and create distance from your thoughts and your feelings, and watching out for some of those particular patterns like catastrophizing, self-talk and blaming. The next thing that you might consider, especially if this is a pattern in your family, that there tends to be a lot of conflict and arguing and fighting happening in the mornings. By the way, whether it's you involved or it might be other people in your household that's fighting and you'd like it to stop, and you're figuring out options that you can use to adjust the environment, I think that the 5 types of conflict are a particularly useful tool that we can apply in this type of a setting. So the 5 types of conflict are data, structure, interest, values, and relationship. So data conflicts, when I do workplace conflict resolution training, this is stuff like the agreement and the contract and the scope of work and the email trail and the meetings that you've had and the minutes, etc. So when we're talking about family conflict, we're thinking about things like who should be doing what, So what are the expectations and how have they been communicated? And what is the level of common understanding around all of those different areas? And where are the potential areas for, what would you say, subjective interpretation? There's still some room for a little bit of ambiguity, like the precedent stuff that I talked about. Like my son expects me to find his socks for him because I did it for him yesterday. That's an example of data conflict. And I can deal with that by correcting the data, saying to him something like early on, just so we're on the same page, you'll need to find your own socks today. Is that okay with you? It's just making sure, literally, that there's a common understanding between us. And if you notice that there's a discrepancy in the data, quote unquote, like they say, I can't find it, the implication there is that they're hoping that you'll do it for them. So maybe it's something like, well, I've got stuff that I need to do right now, but where can you look? So again, I'm clarifying the facts, I'm clarifying the data. The way that I speak should ideally still be calm and composed. If we don't want to cause the other person to get worked up, we should talk or speak in a way that has a low tone, a lower volume, and a slower speed than what we normally might do. For me, that means I need to deliberately walk near them. Like if I stay where I am in the kitchen and they're yelling out from their bedroom, I yell back, I'm doing something, you'll need to find it yourself. But that, unfortunately, has two negative effects. One is that they think that I'm yelling at them and they say, why are you being so mean? You don't have to yell. And I'm like, I'm not being mean. Like, you're in your bedroom. If you don't want me to yell, come down and talk to me. Unfortunately, I sometimes yell that back at them, and you can probably imagine that that's not necessarily something that helps. It usually makes things even worse. But it also makes me angry. Like, I've noticed that when I'm yelling, I usually do that in situations where I'm worked up and upset. So when I think I yell, what's happening is that my brain interprets that behavior and that physical state as a situation that's usually something that needs me to be worked up. So I get worked up. Like our brain is sitting like a dumb, organ in our head, which operates like a blank cave and it can't see or feel anything. It's relying on the information that's coming in through our senses, including what's going on internally. Like it's picking up on things like if we need to go to the toilet or if we're hungry or if we're sore or tired or agitated or our heart's pumping rapidly or we're using a raised voice. Like these are also signals that our brain uses to interpret what's going on in the situation that we're in and basically develop a plan for what we might need to do next. And if it thinks that this is a situation that usually involves escalation, it develops a metabolic plan. It thinks we might need to get worked up here. So our heart rate increases, like we do start to physically escalate. So clarifying the data is the first step, and thinking about the best way to do that, like going to the next room and saying it in a normal kind of volume rather than yelling. There's different ways that you can figure out this, way of clarifying the data, if you know what I mean. The next area that we could consider is structure. Now, this could be things like the structure for the morning, but also things like the structure for communication or decisions. So if there's a particular plan that should be followed in the mornings at your house, like first people get up and get dressed, then they have breakfast, then they brush their teeth, then they pack their bag, like having a chart on the fridge that reminds people of that or discussing it in the morning when you wake up with them might mean that they know what to expect, and there's almost this natural process of reinforcing it rather than you needing to nag them. You could even have a process where they check boxes for each of the stages and maybe even a potential reward that they can get if they do everything right, kind of thing. Like the reason that schools and teachers use these types of positive reinforcement programs is that they work both in terms of reinforcing the understanding of the structure, but also the buy-in and engagement for the kid to actually be doing what they're meant to be doing. You could also be thinking about things like, when does the work happen though? Like, do they pack their bags in the morning? Maybe doing it the night before would work better. Or ordering from the school lunch. Maybe that's not ideal. Like, it's not the absolute healthiest food, but on balance, it would avoid a lot of the stress and tension in the house. So maybe it's something that you do decide to do just for a term or for a few months or something like that. Or maybe just indefinitely. Like, to me, I think we get a little bit too carried away about some of those aspects of diet. I mean, me and my family, I suppose, are relatively healthy, so maybe I haven't experienced some of the risk that's involved, but As long as my son gets enough of what he needs, I don't particularly mind when he gets it. Like if he has a really healthy dinner or a really healthy school lunch, I don't particularly care. Whereas I think teachers, obviously, they only see the lunch. So if they don't see everything that's meant to be there, they might panic, not knowing what he's getting in the other meals. But, of course, that's the decision that you can make as the parent. But when does it happen? How does that lunch get prepared? What's the source of it? All that kind of stuff. And remembering that behavior that is rewarded is likely to be repeated. So if your child gets away with not finding their socks for them, you do it for them, they don't have to find it themselves, then you shouldn't be surprised if the next day they're not up looking for it proactively. Like what they get away with, they're likely to do again. But on the reverse way of thinking about it, if you can think about ways of rewarding good behavior, it increases the chance that they'll start to do it more frequently. So what does your child want? Like, what are the kind of rewards that resonate with them? Some kids really love the charts and the gold stars and all that kind of stuff and seeing progress. Some kids, it's like the stomach is the way to their heart. So it's just sugar and lollies and something like that. Like my son, that's what it is. So we make him do all of his jobs and all the things he needs to do every day for the week. And then he's allowed a few dollars to take to the shops and buy some lollies on the weekend with his friends. To be honest, we probably would have given him the lollies after soccer anyway on the weekends. So to me, it's like a win-win. I've given him something that he was likely to get most of anyway. But he feels like he's worked and he does get a little bit extra anyway. But, it won't be long, I think, before his brain figures that one out and he wants to separate the rewards structurally himself. Whereas at the moment, I still have the advantage as the parent. But what can you do to adjust the structure? Waking up a little bit earlier, having the uniforms ready next to the bed so the kids don't have to go hunting around the house when you do the lunches, how the transport happens, who's involved doing what. Maybe there's older kids that you can engage to help with the younger kids. Thinking about all these kind of things. Maybe even having your parents come and help some morning, all that kind of stuff. Asking your boss to work from home. I did a video a couple of days ago about strategies to use for negotiating working from home from your boss, by the way. If that's something that you'd like to do more frequently, it's a personal passion of mine because I love working from home so much. I really dislike going to the office, and especially the open plan kind of ones. It's just like an energy drain for me. But anyway, I take it that some people don't mind it as much, but gosh, I just find them shocking. So we've talked about data conflict and structure. The next type of conflict that you could consider is interest conflict. This is where you think about things like, what do they want? What's in it for them? And what do you want? Now, this could be things like the lollies and the longer term rewards, but I usually think about that at the structural step. For interest, it's probably more like my son wants attention. He wants autonomy. He wants some level of excitement and fun. He's lazy, so he doesn't want to expend too much energy. He wants particular kind of foods in the morning. He likes hanging around and doing things together. Like he likes it when we brush our teeth at the same time. And if I send him up to do it by himself, of course, it's more boring, so it's less fun. And so that's a lower in his interest. So this is what we can think about here, making the toothbrushing more fun by doing it together. Like that is an example where I give him something that he likes. It's important to him and he values it, time together, and he really does enjoy it. So when he gets a little bit more of that, it tends to be something that really resonates. So I use the if you, then I way of negotiating. If you come up and brush your teeth now, then we can do it together. And maybe we can put a song on to listen to, or a podcast or something like that we can use. There's a really cool podcast called Brushy, by the way, if you have young kids. It's like a 2-minute long story. It's like a little kid that records it with her dad, and they do jokes about a particular topic. Like they'll talk about dolphins or dinosaurs or bacteria or airports or something, so a particular topic, and then you listen to it with your son or your daughter while you're brushing your teeth together. It's a really beautiful thing, but that's an example of interest conflict. Like we negotiate giving them something that they want if we can get something that we want in return. So I really like that way of phrasing things. If you, then I. If you, this is what I want you to do, then I, this is what you want. Or in other words, this is what I need from you in order for me to do that. Oh no, this is what I can do for you. In order for me to do that, I need you to do this. Look, I can chuck the podcast on if we can get up and do it right now. You could also approach this conflict in the morning in terms of values conflict. This is where we ideally discuss what's important to both of us. Like we could say things like, look, for me, I really dislike it when we're rushed and when things are chaotic and, we don't know what everyone's doing. I'd like things to be a little bit more organized. It seems for you, flexibility is something that you really value, and you prefer to be able to make decisions about when you're going to do what in the morning because you might not feel like getting dressed first thing or that kind of stuff. So I just wanted to talk about how we can make both of those things work. Is there some way I can give you a bit of flexibility, but we can also keep the situation a bit more calm? What do you think would help? So I think just stating both values or both perspectives in that neutral, mutual kind of way often helps. And then a question like, what do you think would help? What are your thoughts? What's your take on it? I think just inviting the other person then to speak and then shifting the conversation towards, well, how can we plan this together? Like, what do you think would help? That's roughly what I have in my head. But broadly speaking, I think it seems like we're on different pages here in terms of priorities. And then finally, you would think about the relationship conflict. Now, this is the stuff that you notice. It's getting annoyed at each other, the silent treatment, the yelling and storming upstairs when the parents ask the child to do something. It's that impulse to say, I told you so, or get back at somebody, or you want revenge, or you want them to know just how wrong they've acted or something like that. This is what we would call relationship conflict. It's the cumulative build-up, often of the emotional layer connected to the conflict. So when I yell, when he's upstairs, that yelling, and he says, why are you being so mean to me? That's an example of relationship conflict. Essentially, he's misunderstood me. Like, I'm not angry. I'm just yelling because he's far away. But what happens is that he comes down grumpy, and then I get a little bit more tense, and I say, something like, well, if you don't want me to yell, you can come down and talk to me instead of yelling out a question from me. And then it spreads, and we trigger each other, and there's this contagion. So for me, I think the dual parts of relationship conflict is identifying the patterns, and maybe there's things that we can do to interrupt this, like going upstairs and speaking instead of yelling, even if he's yelled out, or self-regulation, like dealing with my part of that cumulative build-up. So that's the next topic, I guess, that I wanted to talk about, these 5 different types of conflict: the data, structure, interest, values, and relationship. And then the final tool, I guess, that I wanted to present before we finish up the episode today is using coaching skills. Now, with kids, what a lot of them tend to become very skilled at is being the victim. I can't find my socks. Well, they're not in my cupboard. Well, I don't know where to look. Well, they're not in the laundry. You know what I mean? This whinging, complaining, helpless, hopeless, everything else is everyone else's fault, there's nothing that I can do attitude is infuriating. And so many parents that I know find this as a particular trigger. It's the kind of thing that really pushes our buttons. Now, when we're dealing with somebody who comes at us as the victim, the invitation is that we can take on 2 potential other roles. One is that we might begin to play the role of the persecutor. Like, we're the one that's angry at them, or we're the one that's judging them, or we're the one that's causing the problem. Like when my son says, I can't find my socks, what I sometimes do, if I'm honest, is I yell something like, look in your cupboard. You're not a child. Where did you put them? Like, whatever the thing is that's my natural knee-jerk reaction. And I'm slipping into that role. He's the victim and I'm the persecutor. And then he probably, very in a justified way, can say something like, why are you being so mean? Because that's what the persecutor does. They're really mean. And if I'm honest, that is probably what I'm doing. He's annoyed me enough that I'm being overly harsh. Or the other role that we can slip into is the rescuer. I'll do it for you. And they might ask you to do it for them, type of thing. And the challenge there is that it doesn't do anything to improve the child's self-efficacy, like their ability to deal with their own problems doesn't improve at all. If you've gone and found their socks for them today, tomorrow they're going to come to you and say that they can't find their socks. Whereas when we use coaching, and I particularly like the GROW model of coaching, it's an acronym GROW. It stands for goal, reality, options, and way forward. When we think about that model of coaching, the GROW model, the two effects that it tends to have on the coachee, the person who's being coached, is that it improves their level of awareness. That could be things like what's important to them, or maybe they're aware of how they've contributed to the problem, or more aware of their priorities, or more aware of options that they have. And it also helps to instill a sense of responsibility, which I think is probably one of the best antidotes that we have for that victim mentality. And so if you're the kind of parent that wants your kids to stand on their own 2 feet, that GROW model could be a really helpful option for you. And again, I've talked about that model of coaching in both the previous episodes of the Conflict Skills podcast or on my YouTube channel. So let's think about each of the different steps there. The GROW, the first step would be G, which is goal. With each of the steps, the idea of this framework is that you ask questions related to that area. So you would ask questions getting them to articulate the goal. Now, for something simple, like I can't find my socks, it could be a very simple goal that you're helping them to articulate. Like you could ask them something like, have you got one, or do you not have either of them? Or you could ask something like, how much time have we got before we leave? Is that the last thing that you need to do, or are there other things that you still need to do? Like these are questions focused on the goal. I'm getting them to think about the priorities and what's important. I'm not telling them the goal. Do you know what I mean? I'm starting to help them refine the priorities and adjust almost their aim. Like, what are they focused on? So if I ask them a question, like, do you have one of the socks or have you got neither? It helps them to adjust what they think about where they might look or how long it's going to take or all that kind of stuff. This then translates, by the way, to the next situation that they're in. It's one of the reasons I like the coaching approach and why that self-efficacy is so helpful is that it's not just about finding the socks today. This is about how my son learns to deal with a problem that they don't have an immediate answer to. So the next step is the R. These are questions about reality. You could ask them questions like, where have you looked? Or I like questions that get the person to describe the situation, like descriptive questions. Like I asked them something like, how many socks were left in your drawer? So that's a question that forces him to go and look, obviously. But what I'm wanting him to do is to think about the steps that he needs to do to get that information, if you know what I mean. Like, I know this GROW model of coaching initially was used with sports people, and coaches often say things like, keep your eye on the ball. Like, that's often what you remind kids of, that they should concentrate on the game. But asking them a different question, like, which way was the ball spinning when it came towards you? It has no ceiling, no limit on the level of complexity that the person's thought could the type of thought that it could encourage, if you know what I mean. Like they could start to think about the way it was spinning at that level, like which way was the ball spinning, but immediately their brain thinks then about how did that affect the way that the ball bounced or the speed that it was coming at, or how did the opponent player looked when they hit the ball and then it came spinning. That's interesting. Like maybe when they put their feet in this particular way, it puts more spin on the ball. Or what did the player need to do differently to hit a ball that was spinning? Like that descriptive question, I love it because it really creates a connection of the person with the experience. Like you're not making a mistake of misdescribing it, so to speak. Like go and look in your drawer. Well, I have looked and it's not there. Like that type of friction contributes to the escalation. Whereas you saying something like, how many's in your drawer? There's no risk there. It doesn't sound as much like criticism as a question like, have you looked in your drawer? And then if they say no and you say, well, go and bloody look, of course, this is the type of pattern that we probably don't want to introduce, right? Whereas how many's left in your drawer, much more neutral, encourages them to think about the facts in that descriptive way, and it's more likely then to translate to the next situation that they're facing. The O is about options, asking them questions like, where can you start? Is there anyone else upstairs who can help you? We're starting to get their mind thinking about this as a problem with potential things that they can do to solve it. And then the final step, the W, is about the way forward, or what will you do? So there we might, if they say, all right, I'm going to go look upstairs, you could ask them a question like, where are you going to look first? Or if it's not in your bedroom, what are you going to do then? What I'm wanting with my son is to help him walk away from that type of an interaction with me with as clear a plan as possible, with specific steps that he's going to take, because that increases the chances that he's actually going to do it. Whereas if I yell at him something like, go and look upstairs, go and look in your cupboard, is he going to do it? Or am I going to find him spread-eagled on my bed in 10 minutes and now we've only got a very short amount of time before we need to go? And that's my natural trigger for meltdown mode, and angry dad all of a sudden re-emerges. I wonder what you make of that GROW model of coaching. If you already use it, I'd love to know your experiences, and are there particular questions that you tend to find helpful? Are there situations that you use it in? Are there particular strategies that you find work? And if not, I'd love to know, how does it resonate with you? What do you make of it? Is it something that you'd like to give a try? Well, thank you very much for listening. If you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, I really appreciate it. And I'd be incredibly grateful if you would consider pressing, like or subscribe or follow or 5 stars or whatever the various language is in your platform. What's really helpful are just these positive cues to the algorithm that it's working for you. But if you have a question or a bit of feedback, I would love to know that as well. You can often ask a comment or, make some type of interaction on the platform that you're listening to the podcast. Or if you'd like to send me an email, it's podcast@simongoode.com, SIMONGOODE.com. I'm also recording a video of this episode though, so if you'd like to check out the YouTube channel, I'll try and remember to put the link in the show notes below. And I hope to see you again in a future episode of the podcast. Thank you very much for listening and for your time. Bye for now.